Hello, everyone. My name is Anisha, and welcome to the MSc Counselling Research Conference 2024. Today, I will be exploring my thesis titled The Contagion, Contextualizing the Sexual and Intimate Lives of Male Counselors Working with Sexual Violence. As with any qualitative study, an understanding of the author's background is crucial. I am a trainee trauma psychotherapist whose practice has involved working not only with sexual violence survivors, but also family members of child sexual abuse survivors. I am a novice professional who has grown to use a trauma-informed integrative approach involving somatic psychotherapy. I am a cisgender bisexual female who within the UK presents culturally diverse owing to my Indian nationality. So, jumping right in today, I will be taking you through the background to my study, existing theoretical frameworks, the research question, methodology, our results and analysis, closing up with implications and future recommendations. So, to provide a larger context, it's first important to note the impact that sexual violence has on an individual. Apart from vulnerability in various biopsychosocial facets, there is a large negative consequence in how they experience intimacy within themselves and with other people. The interesting part in terms of therapy is how therapists tend to mirror clients' characteristics over time, having internalized their symptoms. Here we pause and reconsider concepts such as countertransference, compassion fatigue, and burnout in counseling work. Essentially, as Figley said, there's a cost to caring. But the question to ask here is what is the cost to caring for trauma, specifically sexual violence trauma? Perlman and Sackwittner have made major headway on that front by operationalizing the concept of vicarious trauma. They speak to the inner experience of therapists who engage empathically with clients and take on their trauma material. While there are numerous symptoms of vicarious trauma, the key symptom to hone in on is the cognitive schema change. Continued exposure to trauma shifts the worldview these therapists hold. This is seen mainly in schemas of trust, safety, power, independence, frame of reference, esteem, and intimacy. Now, let's step back a moment to dive into the sparse literature around this area. There are four main studies worth noticing that have specifically chosen to investigate the effects of vicarious trauma on sexual violence counselors. All of them found a significant disruption of intimacy and trust schemas owing to the counseling work. However, only one of these studies included men as participants. An important finding of this study was that men who worked with sexual violence showed greater disruptions to cognitions of intimacy with others than the norm for mental health professionals overall. All of these studies used various theoretical frameworks to understand the data obtained. The most popular theory being the constructivist self development theory of personality that informs the concept of vicarious trauma. Here, the individual's ability to construct their own realities is based on interpretations of events, and when a traumatic event takes place, it challenges existing cognitive schemas about the self, others, and the world. The cognitive information processing theory functions along the same lines. However, it focuses on how over-accommodation of information from trauma events can lead to skewed schemas about the world. Essentially, the person is now biased because of trauma. The transformative learning theory works in tandem with obtaining a critical political consciousness. Once a therapist is exposed to oppressive narratives of violence, they engage in critical reflection and are transformed in their political consciousness. The main idea that ties in all of these is the just world theory. It is theorized that traumatic life events, or hearing about them, challenges three basic assumptions that people can hold. The first being a belief in personal invulnerability, the view of oneself as a positive light, and belief in a meaningful and orderly world. From all of this background, the research question we land on is how does working with sexual violence impact and influence the sexual and intimate life of male counselors? What is their lived experience? How does being male in this role impact them? what about at a personal level? And specifically, what about their intimate life? To investigate this, the following methodology was adopted. Purposive sampling was utilized to obtain a sample of male sexual violence counselors based in the UK. They were required to be members of a counseling organization, having worked at least a year with sexual violence and receiving an hour of monthly supervision. The study obtained two participants with ages ranging between 35 to 50, and while both of them were in heterosexual partnerships, one of them was married. With 1 to 5 years of counseling experience, one of them presented as a novice professional. The study adopted an exploratory qualitative research design with an interpretive phenomenological approach to analyze the data. A demographic questionnaire was used to filter participants for semi structured interviews. This interview ended up exploring consent and safety, sexuality and gender, countertransference, and intimate life, involving sex and sexual practices. After participants were filtered through the inclusion criteria, they engaged in a 45 to 60-minute interview exploring their lived experience of intimate life as a sexual violence counselor. Data was subjected to participant member check through transcripts being sent to them and analyzed through a 7-step IPA data analysis model. Lastly, quality was maintained through triangulation that was conducted after coding among all the researchers to ensure that there were no blind spots. Additionally, all interviewers went through a training protocol to ensure safety of participants and interviewers themselves. Ethical concerns around interviews were addressed by having a secondary interviewer on standby and a supervisor on call in case of emergencies. Now, coming to the results, three major group experiential themes were identified: psychological distancing, identity positioning, and post traumatic effects and awareness. With the first theme, participants seemed to engage in a process of creating space between themselves and various aspects of the subject. A pervasive sense of discomfort was noted, along with a strong need to self differentiate oneself from male subcultural behaviors and attitudes. However, there was also distancing from the impact of the work itself, with participants choosing to attribute any changes in views and sexual practices to external factors such as media and their own personality. Participants engaged throughout the interviews in a process of carving out their niche identity. This involved how they see their views towards consent having changed over developmental stages and cultural upbringing, and a subtle show of their transition from being takers to receivers of consent. With a staunch position that their views towards consent have not changed, they also only express their relation to their own sexual life in terms of frequency of sex. Lastly, the theme of post traumatic effects and awareness illustrates the changes the participants highlighted throughout their experience. With a newer and more nuanced understanding of concepts such as consent and a shift in gender perceptions, participants also noted the positive impact of witnessing client resilience and growth. To understand psychological distancing, a cognitive approach of construal level theory of psychological distance can be discussed. Here, participants seem to create a social distance between themselves and the male subcultures, such as the laddish subculture. This can be seen as an attempt to reject hegemonic masculinity. However, why was this happening? A gender role conflict is when men are expected socially to behave in a certain way, despite how they feel with it. With masculinity, there is an expectation of restricted emotions and being invulnerable. However, within the space of the interview, there could have been an implied expectation of blunt vulnerability. This reversal of the conflict could be a possible explanation for the distancing and discomfort. Further, the unhelpfulness of the concept of toxic masculinity is brought into view. This nomenclature categorizes men as inherently diseased and infectious. As male counselors working with the vulnerable populations, there is a deep need to be seen as entirely opposite to this idea of a toxic male. In the theme of identity positioning, an endeavor to carve out their own identity within the theme was seen. Falling in line with the constructive self development theory, participants identified stages in their life and events in their life they had grown away from and now did not identify with. They also positioned themselves as transitioned from takers of consent to receivers of consent. This can be explored through the gender differences in sexual consent negotiation. Essentially, men and women vary in their sexual scripts they are socially demanded to follow when engaging in sexual and intimate practices, specifically asking for consent. The scripting theory proposes that socially, men are charged with the responsibility as being initiators of sex. Therefore, with our participants, it can be reasonable why they never narrated stories where they have been givers of consent. However, even within being initiators, participants noted a shift in how they have come to ask for consent, from being a demanding claim to it now being a request for permission. The subtheme of discomfort rears its head again, given the challenges these participants face in attempting to depart from traditional scripts they were socialized to uphold. At a certain level, participants seem to reach a reflective bulwark, specifically with the ability to fully see any changes to concept of consent that they held. There was a sense of, I have always known what consent means, despite their own remarks around how the work has brought nuance to their understanding of consent. This can be linked back to the gender role strain faced as male counselors, who are tasked with upholding the respect that their clients did not receive from other people, largely men. Similarly, their narratives of sex life revolve solely around the frequency of it. While this could be interpreted as discomfort in talking about personal sexual practices, research has established that men frequently attribute frequency of sex to sexual satisfaction. It is possible our participants reach a reflective bulwark there. Lastly, the last group of experiential themes of post traumatic effects and awareness involved ideas that participants were consciously aware and admitted change to. There was a process of reappraisal of the nuance around consent and gender role expectations they held of themselves and others. This can be explained through the transformative learning theory that we discussed before. With their just world ideas challenged, they embraced the opportunity to move away from ideas of consent that they held before or had discomfort holding, admitting that consent can have gray areas. There was a process akin to vicarious post traumatic growth, specifically for one participant who felt a sense of meaningfulness from witnessing client resilience. Given all these pieces of information, the study has two major implications. The first being that men possibly experience vicarious trauma in sexual work differently to women because of being categorized as part of the gender group that predominantly perpetuates violence. Secondly, it is a possibility that what is contagious is not trauma, in as much as the social scripts around masculinity that are played out differently and uncomfortably in a therapeutic setting, posing a considerable challenge to male sexual violence counselors. Given these implications, it would be useful for future studies to include a quantitative element, possibly a mixed methods approach to combat the effects of discomfort and provide a clear understanding of base levels of vicarious trauma through a measure. Further, a gender inclusive target population outside of cisgender therapists would help further the understanding of how social and sexual scripts come into play in their professional and personal lives. Since our study was limited in its participants, a larger sample would be useful, especially in a focus group setting, where discomfort could be combated through a sense of belongingness. As we're closing, I would like to highlight three main takeaways at a personal level. The first being the idea of each of us having been socialized to different social scripts, defining how we engage with clients. The therapy room is not immune. Second, my own reflexivity, along with my observations of the reflective journey my fellow researchers have embarked on, has been incredibly influential in how I now see men and how I understand men in my life. Through sitting with the data, I have become kinder in my own perception of them and the standards that I hold for them based on my own experiences. Lastly, the biggest learning of all has been the recognition of how detrimental the idea of toxic masculinity is as a narrative, which perpetuates stereotypes in itself. Thank you for taking this journey with me. I hope you enjoyed witnessing my research process of turning the focus onto therapists. Please direct any questions you have to the comment section below, or feel free to ping me an email or on Twitter. Thank you so much.